It was a crisp autumn morning in the quiet village of Upper Bramblewood, where the golden leaves fluttered lazily to the ground, and the air carried the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. At the far end of the village, standing in quiet isolation beyond a winding gravel path, was Blackthorn Manor, a grand yet brooding estate that had, for decades, been the subject of whispered speculation among the villagers. The manor had recently come into the possession of Sir Bertram Blackthorn, an aging aristocrat known for his sharp wit. With a mind steeped in vast fortune and a lifetime of eccentricity, he returned to England after years spent abroad, only to seclude himself in his ancestral home. Rarely seen, he was visited only by the few loyal servants who had remained with the family for generations. That was until last week, when he died suddenly. Though the local doctor ruled his death as natural, it unsettled many. Rumors began to swirl, as they often do in villages like Upper Bramblewood, about odd occurrences in the manor, old family feuds, and unsettled debts that extended beyond mere financial matters. As the heirs convened at Blackthorn Manor for the reading of the will, the village buzzed with quiet speculation. Seated at her favorite table in the Rose and Crown tea room, Miss Jane Merrill listened intently. Though she had never met Sir Bertram in person, his reputation preceded him. When a particular piece of information reached her keen ears, she immediately sensed that something was amiss. At the next table, Mrs. Beam, the postmistress, spoke in hushed tones to her friend, sharing whispers about him. She had been in perfect health just the week before, walking about and giving orders as usual, and then gone just like that. Heart failure, they said, but between you and me, I don't believe it. Miss Marple, who had perfected the art of appearing not to listen while listening very carefully, took a sip of her tea. She was about to turn the page of her newspaper when a shadow fell across her table. A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "Inspector Harold Kbor of the County Constabulary," he said, his tone half amused, half serious. "I do hope you're not getting engaged in this already." She gazed up at him with her gentle blue eyes. "Involved, Inspector? I haven't the faintest idea what you mean." Corn sighed, taking the chair opposite her without waiting for an invitation. "Blackthorn Manor. I can see it in your eyes. You're already mulling it over in that extraordinary mind of yours." Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "Well, I must admit, dear Sir Bertram's death does seem rather sudden, and sudden deaths in country houses, they do tend to be interesting, don't they?" Corn folded his arms. Natural causes, no evidence of foul play, no signs of forced entry. The servants were all accounted for. His physician, Dr. Latimer, had been treating him for years and noted nothing unusual. Miss Marple stirred her tea, and yet the inspector sighed, conceding, "There's something about it that doesn't sit well with me either, which is why I came to see you." Miss Marple set down her teaspoon, her eyes bright. "How very flattering." Inspector Kbor leaned forward slightly. "The will is to be read tonight at the manor. The heirs have already arrived. What an unusual gathering of characters. A nephew unseen for years, a companion insisting on a promise of support, a solicitor appearing more anxious than necessary, and the housekeeper, who has been around since before the war, exuding an unsettling calm." Miss Merrill nodded, her fingers delicately poised on her teacup. "And you want me to attend?" Corn exchanged a knowing glance with her. "I need you to keep those keen eyes of yours alert. If anything is amiss, I suspect you'll notice it before I do." Miss Merrill tilted her head slightly. "And if it's merely a case of an old man passing away in his sleep," Corn exhaled, "then we'll both have wasted an evening in a drafty old house." Miss Merrill took one last sip of her tea, set her cup down, and smiled. "Well then, Inspector," she said pleasantly, "it seems we have an engagement at Blackthorn Manor tonight." The evening air was crisp as Miss Merrill arrived at Blackthorn Manor, escorted by Inspector Corn. The grand estate stood in solemn darkness against the silver moonlight, its towering stone walls shrouded in shadow. An iron gate groaned open as they drew near, unveiling a lengthy gravel driveway flanked by gnarled oak trees, their twisted limbs stretching like skeletal fingers into the darkness. The manor loomed ahead, an imposing relic of a forgotten time, its facade draped in ivy that clung tenaciously to the time-worn stone. A flicker of light danced in the upper windows, hinting that the heirs of Sir Bertram Blackthorn had already assembled for the reading of the will. Miss Marple, ever watchful, observed a sleek black motor car parked nearby. Parked near the entrance was an expensive model, clearly out of place in the countryside. "Someone has done rather well for themselves," she murmured to Korn as they ascended the wide stone steps. The inspector knocked twice on the heavy oak doors. Moments later, they swung open, revealing a tall, severe-looking woman in a black dress. "Miss Hargreaves," Cyborn greeted her. "Housekeeper, I presume?" The woman's gaze was unreadable. "That I am, sir. You'll find the rest of the party in the drawing room. The solicitor is about to begin." She stepped aside to let them in. As Miss Marple stepped into the dimly lit hallway, she was instantly enveloped by the heavy silence that hung in the air. Though faint voices drifted from beyond the doors ahead, there was an underlying tension, a sense of being observed. The drawing room was a grand spectacle, its lofty ceilings adorned with intricate wood paneling, a fireplace softly crackling at one end. At the center of the room, a long table hosted the heirs of Sir Bertram Blackthorn, each wearing a look of distinct unease. Miss Marple's gaze. They were enveloped in a moment of scrutiny, each detail meticulously noted. Mr. Geoffrey Blackthorn, the nephew, stood tall in his late 30s, impeccably dressed, yet visibly tense, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm against the table. Miss Evelyn Carter, Sir Bertram's longtime companion, was a woman in her 50s, possessing sharp features and an air of practiced fragility, clutching a lace handkerchief between her delicate fingers. Then there was Mr. Leonard Graves, the solicitor, thin and anxious, adjusting his spectacles as if anticipating a clash of opinions. Hargreaves, the housekeeper, stood silently by the door, her gaze cool and unreadable. Aldous Wyndham, Sir Bertram's physician, was also present, though he had taken a seat in the corner, hands folded neatly in his lap. The solicitor cleared his throat, glancing at a pile of legal documents in front of him. "I appreciate you all coming. As you know, Sir Bertram's will is to be read this evening. However, before we proceed," he hesitated, glancing toward Kbor. "There is an issue that must be addressed." The room tensed. "Geoffrey." Blackthorn straightened in his chair as Korn's gaze swept across the table before he spoke. "Sir Bertram's death was sudden, too sudden, given the circumstances. We will be investigating further." A ripple of tension spread through the room. Evelyn Carter clutched her handkerchief more tightly. "But the doctor," Kbor interrupted, "has confirmed that while Sir Bertram had a weak heart, there was no immediate cause for his sudden passing. And yet, he died alone, without warning." His voice hardened. "Someone in this house may." More than they are saying, a heavy silence followed. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her expression mild. "Inspector," she said gently, "I do believe we should let the good solicitor finish his reading first. Wills have a curious way of illuminating people's true intentions." Korn hesitated, then gave a brief nod. "Proceed, Mr. Graves." The solicitor adjusted his spectacles, flipping through the pages. Sir Bertram Blackthorn, in full possession of his faculties, made the following arrangements regarding his estate. As he read, Miss Marple studied the faces. Around her subtle reactions, flickers of emotion danced, a moment of tension here, a suppressed smile there. Then came the moment of true revelation, and the entire estate of Blackthorn Manor, including all assets, would be. He paused. Miss Evelyn Carter leaned forward ever so slightly, her breath catching. Geoffrey's fingers stopped tapping. Graves continued. Miss Jane Merrill of St. Mary's sat in stunned silence, blinking as her knitting needles stilled in her hands. "Well," she said mildly, "that is rather unexpected, Evelyn." Carter let her handkerchief fall, and Geoffrey Blackthorn sprang to his feet. "This is absurd." The solicitor fumbled with his papers. "I assure you, the document is legitimate." Miss Hargreaves remained impassive, while the doctor in the corner raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Kbor exhaled sharply. "That does change things." Miss Marple, ever composed, set her knitting aside. "It does indeed, and I must say I find it quite fascinating." She turned to the solicitor. "Tell me, Mr. Graves, when exactly was this will drafted?" Graves adjusted his glasses. "A week prior to Sir Bertram's passing." Miss Merle remarked on the peculiar nature of Geoffrey Blackthorn's fury. "You mean to tell me that my uncle left everything to a woman he never met?" Evelyn Carter appeared almost faint at the revelation. "He promised to provide for me," Miss Merle noted, observing them both in silence. And yet, here we are. He must have had his reasons. Her gaze subtly shifted to Miss Hargreaves, the housekeeper, and for the first time, a flicker of something crossed the older woman's expression, just a fraction of a second, but Miss Merle noticed it. Something was amiss. There was something profoundly unsettling about Blackthorn Manor. Sir Bertram had altered his will at the last moment, excluding those nearest to him, and then he passed away. Miss Marple clasped her hands together, a contemplative smile gracing her lips. "Well, Inspector," she remarked with a lightness in her voice, "I do believe this has turned out to be rather more intriguing than either of us expected." Cor let out a breath. "You're relishing this, aren't you?" Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her fingers working with a steady rhythm. "Oh, my dear Inspector," she replied softly, her eyes sparkling with a subtle amusement. "You have no idea." The atmosphere in the room was heavy with anticipation as the echoes of the will's reading lingered in the air. The solicitor's voice had faded into silence, his hands quivering slightly as he adjusted his glasses. Miss Marple, with her characteristic air of mild amusement, scrutinized the reactions of those present. Geoffrey Blackthorn had taken on a disturbing hue, his fists tightly clenched at his sides. "This is preposterous," he exclaimed sharply. "My uncle must have been manipulated. There's no other explanation." Evelyn Carter's lips formed a thin line. Her hand trembled as she reached for her glass of sherry. "I simply cannot believe it," she murmured, her voice unsteady. After all these years, the housekeeper, Miss Hargreaves, remained impassive, though Miss Marple did not miss the slight tightening of her jaw. The woman was too calm, too controlled. Inspector Cor said, "No one is making any accusations yet, Mr. Blackthorn, but we must consider the facts. Sir Bertram changed his will 1 week before his death, cutting out every person expected to inherit, and then quite suddenly he died alone in his study." Miss Marple, still knitting, tilted her head slightly. Was it his usual habit to be alone late at night? The housekeeper spoke for the first time. Sir Bertram preferred his solitude. Miss Marple, he often worked late into the night. Miss Marple gave her a pleasant smile. "How very industrious. And tell me, Miss Hars, who was the last person to see him alive?" The woman hesitated. "I brought him his tea at 9 o'clock, as I always did. He dismissed me shortly after. I jotted something in his notebook. No one else entered the study." Hargreaves stiffened slightly. "Not to my knowledge, Inspector." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers still working at her knitting, and the tea was the same as he always drank. The housekeeper's eyes flickered ever so slightly. It was his preferred blend. "Yes." Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "How very curious." Geoffrey exhaled sharply. "None of this changes the fact that my uncle would never have left his fortune to a stranger. That will is a forgery." The solicitor, still pale, shook his head. "I assure you, Mr. Blackthorn, I prepared the documenting myself under Sir Bertram's explicit instructions." Evelyn Carter spoke up, her voice sharper now. "But why would he do such a thing?" Miss Marple observed her thoughtfully. "Indeed, Miss Carter, why would he?" She reached into her handbag and produced the very document that had been burning in her mind since she stepped foot in Blackthorn Manor. A letter delivered to her home in St. Mary Me 3 days ago, the letter that had brought her here tonight. She unfolded it carefully, her voice calm as she read aloud. "Miss Marple, there is a reason to suspect that my life is at risk. Some would rather I keep quiet. Time may not be on my side, and if anything were to occur, the answers you seek could lie within Blackthorn Manor. Trust no one. Bertram Blackthorn." A heavy silence enveloped the room as Miss Merle raised her gaze, her blue eyes now keen. "Well then," she said with a pleasant demeanor, "shall we begin unraveling a murder?" The atmosphere remained thick with tension as the implications of Sir Bertram's letter weighed heavily on those gathered. Miss Merle meticulously folded the parchment, her thoughts clearly racing. Her expression remained calm, though her keen blue eyes observed everything. Inspector Corn sighed deeply, rubbing his temple. "Let me clarify, sir. Bertram reached out to you, fearing for his life, and then he conveniently dies a week later." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "Yes, Inspector, I believe that is exactly what transpired." Geoffrey Blackthorn, still standing, pounded his fist on the table. If he felt threatened, why didn't he approach the police? Miss Marple regarded him with a gentle, grandmotherly patience. I suspect he was fully aware of the challenges in proving anything without solid evidence, and regrettably, it appears he was correct. Evelyn Carter's tone was laced with disbelief. But why reach out to you of all people? Miss Merrill responded with a pleasant smile. I often ponder the same question, Miss Carter. However, it seems Sir Bertram must have heard of my modest achievements in the past. Inspector Corn cleared his throat. Right, we'll consider this as suspicious circumstances until we can determine otherwise. Now, let's review the details. Once more, you were all present the night Sir Bertram met his end, which implies that someone in this very space possessed both the means and the opportunity to do him harm. Geoffrey scoffed, dismissing the notion. We don't even know that he was murdered. Miss Marple's expression remained unchanged. Oh, I rather think we do, dear boy. You see, it's really quite straightforward. She directed her gaze towards Miss Harries, the housekeeper, whose hands remained tightly folded before her. You brought Sir Bertram his tea at 9 o'clock. Did he drink it immediately? Miss Harries' fingers twitched. I don't know. He was busy at his desk. Miss Marple nodded in agreement. And who prepared the tea? There was a brief moment of hesitation before the housekeeper replied. I did. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, intrigued. Evelyn's gaze flitted between them. What are you implying? Miss Marple did not answer right away. Instead, she turned to Dr. Aldous Wyndham, who had been quietly observing from the corner. Doctor, when you examined the body, did you notice anything unusual? Dr. Wyndham adjusted his glasses. Sir Bertram's death appeared consistent with heart failure. However, it struck me as peculiar that his fingernails had darkened slightly, and there was a faint trace of frothing at the lips. Poor straightened. Frothing at the lips? Miss Marple gave a small, satisfied nod. Yes, a rather classic symptom of digitalis poisoning. A lethal dose could convincingly mimic heart failure, especially in an older man with a known weak heart. Evelyn let out a soft gasp. Poison? What that means? Miss Marple offered a gentle smile. It means, dear Miss Carter, that Sir Bertram did not die of natural causes at all. He was murdered. A stunned silence followed. Silence enveloped the room as Inspector Corn's jaw tightened. Miss Marple cast another glance at Miss Harries, then posed the crucial question. Who had access to the tea? A fleeting expression crossed the housekeeper's face, one that resembled fear. Geoffrey, however, directed his intense gaze toward Dr. Wyndham. Wait a moment, he said, realization dawning. The doctor was treating my uncle. He had access to his medications. Digitalis is used for heart conditions, isn't it? How do we know it wasn't you? Wyndham stiffened, indignation rising. That's absurd. Kbor interjected, raising a hand. Enough. No one leaves this house until we get to the bottom of this. Miss Marple's eyes glimmered with something akin to amusement. Oh, I do think that's rather unnecessary. Inspector Corn frowned. How do you mean? Miss Marple set aside her knitting, her voice perfectly serene. Because you see, I already know who did it. All eyes turned to her in shocked silence, and Miss Marple, with the air of a woman merely discussing the weather, smiled. Shall I explain? The tension in the drawing room was palpable. All eyes were fixed on Miss Marple, who sat poised and ready to reveal the truth. Comfortably settled in her chair, her knitting resting in her lap, the faintest hint of amusement twinkled in her eyes as she surveyed the assembled characters. Inspector Kbor crossed his arms, addressing her directly. Well, Miss Merrill, if you know who did it, I suggest you enlighten us. With a pleasant nod, she replied, Oh, I do believe I shall. You see, dear Inspector, there is a rather simple pattern to all of this. Poison is a coward's method. It requires forethought, access, and above all, a very particular kind of knowledge. Her gaze shifted toward Dr. Wyndham, who had been silent for too long now. Doctor, you were responsible for Sir Bertram's medical care, were you not? Dr. Wyndham bristled. Of course I was, but as I said, his heart failed. It was entirely consistent with his age and condition. If I suspected foul play, I would have reported it immediately. Miss Merrill nodded. Yes, quite so. But the thing is, Doctor, you were the one who confirmed that Sir Bertram's heart was weak enough that no one would question his sudden passing. It is rather fortunate, don't you think, that his symptoms aligned perfectly with a natural cause of death. A flicker of something crossed OM's face, perhaps irritation. Are you accusing me of murder, Miss Marple? She smiled sweetly. Oh heavens, no. You see, you had the knowledge but not the motive. In fact, I believe you were telling the truth earlier. You truly didn't suspect poison until I mentioned it just now. That dear doctor rather clears you. Wendam blinked in surprise, clearly having expected the opposite. Korn exhaled. Then who did it? Miss Marple's expression didn't change. The answer, I'm afraid, was rather obvious. From the very beginning, the atmosphere was thick with tension as the tea was prepared. The silence was almost palpable, and all eyes turned to Miss Hargreaves, the housekeeper. She stood motionless, her hands clutching the folds of her dress a bit too tightly. Geoffrey Blackthorn sprang to his feet, accusingly declaring, "It was her. She poisoned my uncle." Miss Merrill raised a hand, interjecting, "Not so fast, Mr. Blackthorn." Yes, Miss Hargreaves prepared the tea, but was she the one who poisoned it? That is the crucial question. Korn frowned, seeking clarity. Then what are you suggesting, Miss Merrill? With a small sigh, Miss Merrill shook her head, stating, "It's dreadfully simple. The poison must have been added to the tea before Sir Bertram drank it. The housekeeper prepared the tray, yes, but was she the only one who had access to it?" A hush fell over the room. Evelyn Carter, who had been uncharacteristically silent, shifted in her chair. Miss Marr's gaze settled on her, and for the first time that evening, Evelyn looked truly afraid. "Miss Carter," Miss Marr said gently, "would you care to explain why you were seen in the hallway outside Sir Bertram's study just before 9:30 that evening?" Evelyn paled. I wasn't." "Oh, but you were," Miss Merrill interrupted, her voice kind yet firm. "You see, I spoke to the maid, Alice, before I arrived tonight. She recalled seeing you hovering near the study door that evening, and when she asked if you needed anything, you dismissed her rather hastily." Evelyn's hands trembled. "That means nothing." Miss Merrill pressed on, her voice steady. "Miss Hargreaves, after preparing the tea, you left it on the serving table in the corridor, did you not?" The housekeeper, now visibly shaken, nodded. "Yes, miss, I always leave it there." For a few moments, as I attended to the evening lamps, Miss Marple nodded in understanding. During that fleeting interval, someone had the chance to introduce the poison into the cup. The room fell silent as Miss Marple directed her steady gaze at Evelyn Carter. "And you, dear Miss Carter, were alone in that very corridor at that exact moment." Evelyn's lips parted, her breath quickening. "This is absurd." Jeffy's voice cut through the tension. "You poisoned him." Now, Miss Marple interjected smoothly. "Let's hear why she did it, shall we?" The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension, a stifling silence enveloping them. Evelyn trembled, her facade of control unraveling before their eyes. "You don't understand," she murmured, desperation lacing her words. He promised he would take care of me." Miss Merle regarded her with a tilted head, the weight of her response heavy in the air. "And yet, he altered his will, excluding you completely." A choked sound escaped Evelyn, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I had no choice," she stammered, anguish etched on her face. "He was going to leave me with nothing after all those years, after everything I did for him." Kbor stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "So you poisoned him for money?" Evelyn's expression contorted in response. Anguish consumed her as she recounted the events. "He took everything from me," she exclaimed, her voice breaking. "I was desperate, and when I saw the tea sitting there unattended..." She trailed off, burying her face in her hands. The tension hung heavily in the air. Inspector Korn exhaled, his voice steady as he declared, "Evelyn Carter, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Sir Bertram Blackthorn." As he secured the cuffs around her wrists, Evelyn let out a ragged sob. Miss Merrill, ever composed, simply folded her hands together and sighed. "It's always the same, you know. People assume murder is some grand spectacle, an intricate plan, yet in reality, it often proves to be rather mundane." Korn looked at her unremarkable demeanor as Miss Marple acknowledged. "Indeed, just a hint of chance, a sprinkle of urgency, and one minor blunder. That's all it requires." Kbor sighed, massaging his temples. "Remind me never to engage in a card game with you, Miss Marple." She grinned. "Oh, Inspector, that would be quite unwise." Meanwhile, as Evelyn was escorted away, Geoffrey Blackthorn sank back into his chair, appearing completely exhausted. Miss Hargreaves, still visibly rattled, let out a deep breath as if she had just. Miss Marple escaped her own execution, smoothing her skirt. Well, I do believe that concludes matters quite neatly. Corn sighed. Neatly for you, perhaps. I'll be drowning in paperwork for the next week. Miss Marple chuckled softly. Come now, Inspector, surely that is preferable to drowning in mystery. Corn groaned, and with that, Miss Marple retrieved her knitting and left Blackthorn Manor. Just another case solved over a cup of tea. The end.